You're just a maid. What could you possibly know? John Harrington's voice echoed across the polished marble floor of the 27th floor boardroom, his tailored navy suit catching the soft afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Lila Thompson's fingers tightened around the stack of papers she carried, her knuckles whitening against the crisp edges. The office fell silent, every executive in the room shifting uneasily in their leather chairs as the words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. Lila took a measured breath, the scent of fresh ink and lemon polish filling her senses, and she didn't respond immediately. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the shiny tiles as she stepped closer to the large walnut conference table, the reflection of sunlight bouncing off the glass surface and catching John's narrowed eyes. Around her, the hum of air conditioning seemed louder, almost oppressive, the distant sound of city traffic muted behind the thick double-paned glass. She glanced down at the contract, noting the subtle wording hidden in paragraph C, line 3, and her mind raced. Months of late nights studying legal documents, of deciphering complex clauses in university law classes, and years of observation while cleaning offices like this one had led her here. She knew the mistake before anyone else did. A faint ripple passed through the room. The assistants exchanged worried glances, papers rustling under their fingertips as they sensed the tension. John Harrington smirked, leaning back slightly in his chair, the cufflinks on his sleeves glinting in the light, and let out a short, condescending laugh that made Lila's pulse quicken. The camera of perception in her mind focused on each detail. The way his gold watch caught the light, the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way the sunlight highlighted the sharp lines of his face. Her heart kept a steady rhythm, matching the slow beat of the ticking clock on the far wall. She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze calmly, unflinching, letting the silence stretch. Each second felt drawn out, the world narrowing to this moment of confrontation. Lila's training, her instinct for detail, her quiet confidence in her understanding of contracts, all coalesced into a single point of awareness. She was ready. Then, soft but precise, she spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite the tension. "Sir, this clause shifts all liability to Harrington Enterprises if any part of the merger fails. It's a trap." The words landed like stones on still water, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. John's eyebrows shot up, his smirk faltering as the murmurs of the staff rose quietly, almost imperceptibly. Lila's hand remained steady on the papers, her posture upright, a subtle assertion of authority that contrasted with her uniform. She was small, her frame not imposing, but her presence filled the room. The sunlight fell across her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw and the unwavering focus in her brown eyes. John Harrington's mouth opened slightly, then closed, a flicker of doubt crossing his expression, and the air seemed heavier, charged with a sudden awareness that perhaps this maid knew more than she appeared to. Every polished surface, every reflective pane of glass, every neatly stacked folder became part of the tableau of tension, the quiet stillness that preceded the storm of realization. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, but within the boardroom, time seemed suspended as Lila Thompson stood firm, ready to reveal the knowledge that could change everything. The room remained suspended in silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and made every minor movement echo with significance. Lila Thompson shifted slightly, the soft creak of her sneakers on the polished floor seeming louder than it should have been, while her fingers traced the edge of the contract in a motion that was both deliberate and calming. John Harrington sat rigid in his leather chair, his gaze fixed on the document, his mind running through every possible outcome of ignoring her warning. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the boardroom, catching the reflective surfaces of the mahogany table, the glass water carafe, and the meticulously stacked folders, creating a lattice of light and shadow that fell across Lila's determined face. The assistant sitting closest to her glanced at the scene, eyes wide, hands frozen above the keyboard, and another executive nudged his neighbor softly, as if questioning whether they had all heard correctly. The distant hum of the city outside rose and fell like a slow tide, but inside the room, time seemed to stretch, the usual rhythm of typing, shuffling papers, and whispered conversation having evaporated entirely. Lila remained poised, her back straight, Her chest lifted slightly as though she drew strength from the very light filtering through the windows. The faint scent of polished wood mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee lingering on the table, anchoring the senses in the tangible world even as uncertainty hung in the air. John exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the quiet click of a pen being set down on the table, and his sharp eyes scanned the paragraph she had highlighted, the weight of realization beginning to press upon him. Around the room, other executives began subtle gestures of acknowledgment, small shifts in posture, an almost imperceptible leaning forward as they too examined the clause more carefully, their initial disbelief giving way to concern. Lila's brown eyes did not waver, and in that calm, measured stare there was an unspoken assertion of knowledge and capability that contrasted starkly with her humble uniform. The simple cotton blouse and neatly pressed black slacks a visual testament to her understated confidence. She breathed slowly, allowing the rhythm of her heart to steady her nerves, the cool light of the afternoon painting a gentle glow across her features. Every second felt drawn taut with expectation, the suspended moment stretching like a taut wire ready to snap with revelation. The subtle shuffle of paper, the faint intake of breath from John, the delicate glimmer of sunlight off his gold cufflinks, the quiet attention of the room, all combined into a delicate equilibrium that balanced on her courage and the precision of her words. For the first time, the room felt less like a stage for power and more like a crucible of truth, each individual sensing the gravity of the moment, the silent acknowledgement that the smallest voice, when precise and certain, could shift the balance of authority in a single utterance. Lila did not move from her stance, and the calm intensity of her presence seemed to anchor the energy around her, drawing the attention of every eye, bending the focus of the room toward the clarity of what she had uncovered and the implications that would follow if it were ignored. Lila Thompson shifted her weight slightly, the faint squeak of her shoes against the polished marble floor almost lost beneath the soft hum of the air conditioning. She allowed her gaze to sweep across the room once more, noting the expressions of the gathered executives, each face frozen between disbelief and curiosity. The sunlight angled through the windows, creating sharp lines across the dark wood conference table and casting reflections on the gold-rimmed frames of the certificates on the far wall, illuminating the contrast between opulence and the modest uniform she wore. In that moment, Lila's mind moved with precision, recalling the hours spent poring over similar contracts in her college days, the late nights reviewing clauses and footnotes, each annotation building toward this understanding. The room seemed suspended in time. The usual noises of the office, keyboards tapping, phones buzzing, soft murmurs, fading into an almost tangible stillness, broken only by the faint shifting of papers in the hands of those closest to the table. John Harrington leaned forward slightly, the faint creasing at the corners of his eyes betraying his growing tension, his gaze locking with hers as he followed the exact wording of paragraph C, tracing each phrase as if it might change under scrutiny. Lila's posture remained composed, her shoulders squared, her hands resting gently on the edge of the contract, the subtle tension in her fingers reflecting the weight of her words without any overt display. Each breath she drew was measured, syncing with the rhythm of the room, a quiet pulse that seemed to anchor the space in anticipation. The assistant beside John fidgeted with the pen in her hand, eyes darting between Lila and the clause she had highlighted, while another executive leaned back slightly, brows furrowed, the light catching the reflective surface of her glasses. Outside the windows, the city continued its relentless pace, cars moving in streams along the avenues and distant sirens punctuating the urban hum. But inside the boardroom, the entire focus centered on the quiet certainty radiating from Lila. She had learned long ago that calm precision often carried more weight than raised voices, and now the proof of her knowledge was before them, ready to shift the balance. Her eyes lingered momentarily on the polished edge of the table, catching the sunlight, before returning to John's, a silent assertion that what she spoke was grounded in fact, not conjecture. The air grew heavier as he adjusted the papers before him, his posture shifting imperceptibly as he weighed the implications, and a subtle murmur passed among the other executives, their attention fully captured by the clarity of her observation. Every reflective surface, Every sharp angle of light and shadow seemed to accentuate the contrast between authority and understanding, wealth and insight, power and quiet competence. Lila Thompson stood unwavering, a single point of focus amidst the grandeur, her presence commanding attention not through status or title, but through the undeniable accuracy of her words, the meticulous observation of detail, and the quiet confidence that carried more weight than any chair, any suit, any gold cufflink in the room. John Harrington leaned back slightly, the sharp angle of sunlight glinting off his desk and catching the edges of the polished wooden conference table, reflecting a pattern of light that seemed almost deliberate, as if marking the path of realization spreading slowly across his face. Lila Thompson remained upright, her posture calm and measured, the subtle creases in her uniform blending with the soft shadows cast by the afternoon sun. The assistant nearest the table lifted her hand, then hesitated, sensing the shift in energy as the room collectively acknowledged that this was no ordinary observation, that the quiet maid had uncovered a critical detail that could not be ignored. Papers that had seemed routine a moment ago now carried the weight of consequence, and the murmured exchange of glances between the executives reinforced the tension, each person acutely aware that the balance of authority was poised on the edge of discovery. Outside, the distant hum of the city rose and fell, the muted sounds of traffic and pedestrian movement a soft backdrop to the intense stillness within, contrasting sharply with the concentrated focus of those inside the boardroom. Lila's eyes moved briefly over the polished surface of the table, catching the reflection of John's tightening jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes, noting the subtle but unmistakable signs that doubt had begun to take root. The lighting in the room, a mixture of natural sunlight and the soft glow of overhead fixtures, highlighted the contours of her calm expression and the precise way she had positioned her hands on the contract, reinforcing the quiet authority she now held over the situation. The room's acoustics carried the faint sound of a pen tapping against a notebook, the soft rustle of paper as executives instinctively reached for the contract to double-check the details she had cited, each movement punctuating the growing awareness that the implications of the clause were significant. Lila's mind was alert, processing every subtle cue, from the slight shift in posture of the man across the table to the careful way the sunlight illuminated each line of the document, turning the mundane office materials into tools for understanding. Her presence, understated yet commanding, seemed to stabilize the air in the room, the combination of her calm demeanor and precise articulation making it impossible for anyone to dismiss her insight. John Harrington's fingers hovered briefly over the pen in front of him, then moved to hold the contract more securely, his eyes scanning the highlighted section again, a trace of surprise flickering through the otherwise controlled expression on his face. Each second stretched with importance, the boardroom holding its collective breath as the implications unfolded silently. The contrast between the power embodied in the room's furnishings and the quiet intelligence of the woman standing before them becoming ever more pronounced. Lila's subtle movements, a slight adjustment of her stance, the measured breathing, the way her gaze never faltered, all reinforced the quiet assertion of her knowledge and competence, the room bending imperceptibly toward the acknowledgment that the smallest, most unassuming voice could carry clarity that even the most powerful could not ignore. The afternoon sunlight continued to trace lines across the walls and floor, a slow, deliberate dance of light and shadow marking the passage of time, as each executive silently weighed the truth of her observation against their expectations and assumptions, the atmosphere thick with realization and restrained anticipation. Lila Thompson took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the quiet weight of the moment settle around her, her eyes scanning the fine print of the contract one last time before speaking. Every detail she had learned through years of careful study and observation coalesced into a clear understanding of the potential consequences of a single signature, and she allowed that clarity to guide her next words. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows painted long lines across the polished floor, glinting off the edges of the mahogany table and reflecting softly in the glass of water carafes and the metallic pens scattered across the room, emphasizing the contrast between the sterile elegance of the office and the grounded presence of the woman standing in the middle of it. John Harrington's hands hovered over the contract, the faint movement betraying the first hints of doubt as he realized the gravity of her observation, his normally unwavering confidence now tinged with uncertainty. Lila's posture remained composed, a steadying force in the charged atmosphere, her brown eyes calm and focused, reflecting the afternoon light with a quiet intensity. The assistants and executives around the table exchanged glances, subtle shifts of heads, and raised eyebrows indicating the first cracks in their assumptions about authority and knowledge, the room collectively recognizing that this was a moment of rare clarity emerging from an unexpected source. The faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant city sounds outside seemed to recede, leaving only the crisp, clean lines of the office, the fine grain of the wooden table, and the deliberate stillness of Lila as she prepared to make her point. Every subtle gesture, the light adjustment of a hand on the edge of the table, the slight tilt of her head, the calm, measured blinking of her eyes, added weight to her presence, a silent command that drew the attention of everyone in the room toward the truth she was about to lay bare. John's gaze followed the exact wording she had highlighted, his lips pressing into a thin line as he considered the implications, the faint furrow of his brow revealing the first stirrings of introspection. Lila allowed herself a moment to feel the rhythm of her own heartbeat, steady and deliberate, matching the slow pulse of anticipation in the room, each second amplifying the impact of her knowledge. The polished surface of the table caught a brief reflection of her face, the light glancing off the soft highlights of her hair, reminding all present that clarity and insight often came from the most unassuming places. As she raised her eyes to meet John's once more, the silence stretched long enough that it became almost tangible, a quiet pressure that emphasized the significance of what she had discovered and the importance of the next words she would speak. Her presence a quiet assertion of authority grounded not in position or title, but in careful observation, preparation, and unwavering confidence. Every movement, every glance, every breath in the room contributed to a growing realization that power was not solely defined by wealth or status, and that the calm certainty of knowledge, when wielded with precision, could command the attention and respect of even the most powerful figures in the room. Lila Thompson's voice cut through the stillness of the room, calm yet unwavering, each word deliberate and measured as she explained the implications of the clause with precise clarity. Sir, if this section is executed as it stands, Harrington Enterprises would be fully liable for any disputes or defaults arising from the merger. Vaughn Global would be insulated entirely. The words settled over the room like a quiet wave, drawing every eye toward her. John Harrington's pen paused midair, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he processed the depth of her insight, his usual composure cracking under the weight of possibility. The sunlight glinting across the polished surface of the conference table caught the edges of the contract, throwing reflections into Lila's steady gaze and emphasizing the contrast between the rigid authority he embodied and the meticulous precision she carried with quiet confidence. Around the room, executives leaned forward subtly, the faint rustle of papers and the quiet adjustment of chairs signaling the shift in attention as they all recognized the gravity of the moment. Lila maintained her posture, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, shoulders squared, her brown eyes scanning each expression, silently noting the rising unease and tentative acknowledgment that she had articulated a truth previously unseen. The hum of the air conditioning mingled with the distant sounds of the city outside, creating a muted rhythm that underscored the tension, while the sunlight continued to illuminate the lines of her face, highlighting the calm determination in her expression. John Harrington exhaled slowly, the sound soft but weighted, as his gaze traced the highlighted lines of the contract once more, each phrase now heavy with potential consequence, and the realization of her accuracy began to permeate his thoughts. Lila's focus did not waver, her body language conveying authority not through volume or position, but through the precise delivery of knowledge and the quiet assurance of her understanding. The assistants and executives around the table exchanged subtle glances, the quiet murmurs of acknowledgment barely audible, but carrying a significant shift in perception, the room collectively adjusting to the understanding that a single voice, calmly and intelligently expressed, could command attention and consideration over any presumption of power or status. Light caught the gold accents on John's cufflinks and the polished pins on the table, a stark contrast to the modest fabric of Lila's uniform, underscoring the disparity of position yet highlighting the undeniable authority of insight and preparation. Every reflective surface, every pattern of light and shadow in the room seemed to accentuate the moment, each subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the steady placement of her hands, the slight inhale before she continued, reinforcing the quiet insistence of her observation. Time seemed to slow, each breath, each shifting of weight, each glance across the room magnifying the suspense, the understanding that knowledge, precision, and confidence could challenge assumptions and shift the balance of authority more effectively than any ostentatious display of wealth or title. Lila's calm articulation created a subtle resonance, the room bending imperceptibly toward recognition of her correctness, the tension thickening as every eye remained fixed, every thought silently acknowledging that the smallest, most unassuming presence often carried the most profound impact, and that clarity spoken with certainty demanded attention from even the most powerful individuals present. Lila Thompson felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere as John Harrington's initial disbelief began to give way to restrained consideration, the faint tightening of his jaw and the careful repositioning of the contract signaling that her words had pierced his usual veneer of authority. The executives around the table exchanged almost imperceptible glances, leaning slightly forward as if drawn by the gravity of the insight she had shared, their earlier smirks and murmurs replaced by attentive focus. The sunlight continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the contrast between the gleaming surfaces of the room and the understated presence of Lila, her modest uniform and composed posture now commanding a quiet respect that transcended the ostentation surrounding her. Each subtle movement, the careful placement of a pen on the table, the slight shift of weight from one foot to another, the deliberate pause before speaking, added to the tension, creating a rhythm that synchronized with the unspoken awareness growing among all present that this was a pivotal moment. John's fingers hovered over the edge of the contract, tracing the highlighted clause once again, and the faint furrow in his brow deepened as the implications became clear, his mind running through every possible consequence of ignoring her observation. The air seemed charged, the normally neutral sounds of the office, the soft hum of computers, the distant murmur of conversation outside the boardroom, receding into near silence, leaving only the interplay of light and shadow, the subtle movements of people, and the quiet intensity of Lila's gaze. Her brown eyes remained fixed on him, unwavering, conveying certainty and command without a single raised voice or exaggerated gesture, the calm confidence of someone who had prepared meticulously and understood precisely what was at stake. The assistants nearby adjusted their posture, papers shifting under their hands as they followed the unfolding realization, each subtle adjustment reinforcing the growing acknowledgment that Lila's insight had altered the dynamics of the room entirely. Light glinted off the polished surfaces, the gold rim of a pen, the edge of the table, the reflective glass of a nearby award, and each reflection seemed to underscore the contrast between perceived authority and the quiet power of informed observation. John exhaled slowly, a long, measured breath that carried with it the weight of dawning comprehension, his eyes flicking up to meet hers, recognition dawning in the depth of his gaze. Lila did not flinch, did not break her stance, but allowed the quiet authority of truth to fill the space, every micro-expression and shift of her posture reinforcing the clarity of her position. The room, once filled with assumptions of hierarchy and status, had transformed into a space of attentive evaluation, where knowledge and precision spoke louder than title, and where the subtle, deliberate demonstration of insight held more sway than the traditional markers of power. Each second stretched, the tension palpable yet controlled, every breath a testament to the effect that quiet, confident clarity could have when it intersected with authority untested, and the realization that the smallest presence, when armed with preparation and precision, could command the attention of all who had assumed otherwise. Lila Thompson stood motionless for a heartbeat, letting the silence in the room expand and fill every corner, the stillness acting as a quiet amplifier of her presence. The faint light from the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, painting golden streaks across the polished mahogany table and catching the edges of the pens, folders, and the contract she had highlighted so meticulously. Her eyes, calm and unwavering, scanned the room as though measuring the weight of every gaze upon her, each glance from the executives registering a subtle acknowledgment of the truth she carried. John Harrington's posture shifted, a slight lean forward that betrayed his careful consideration, the faint tightening of his jaw reflecting the internal assessment of the implications he had just been confronted with. The assistants and colleagues around the table were no longer exchanging furtive glances, but had begun to sit straighter, hands resting lightly on the table, their focus now fully drawn to the quiet authority radiating from Lila. The room's acoustics allowed even the softest noises, the subtle creak of a chair, the faint rustle of paper, to resonate, emphasizing the contrast between the opulent surroundings and the understated power of precise knowledge delivered without pretense. Lila's hands rested gently on the edge of the contract, fingertips brushing the smooth surface, a deliberate yet subtle motion conveying confidence without any need for volume or flourish. Outside, the city hummed in distant rhythm, the sound of traffic and pedestrian movement a soft backdrop to the intense concentration inside, each breath in the room sinking to the measured cadence of tension and understanding. Light reflected off the glass awards and metallic accents, casting small glimmers across the polished wood, each reflection accentuating the delicate balance of observation, insight, and authority. John Harrington's eyes flicked up from the contract, meeting hers with a spark of recognition, a fleeting acknowledgment that the assumptions he had carried into the room were being quietly challenged. The atmosphere thickened with the weight of attention, the realization that careful preparation, clear understanding, and the calm articulation of truth could reshape the dynamics of power, even in a space traditionally dominated by status and title. Lila's quiet steadiness anchored the energy of the room, her posture, her deliberate breathing, and her unflinching gaze creating a resonance that shifted the attention of everyone present. The sunlight continued its slow journey across the floor, tracing lines and patterns that intersected with shadows and reflections, turning the room into a tableau of focus and anticipation. Every subtle movement, the tilt of a head, the alignment of fingers on the contract, the measured exhale before a word was spoken, reinforced her quiet dominance in the situation, the clarity and precision of her knowledge asserting more influence than any outward display of wealth or position. The executive's eyes followed each of her movements, drawn in by the invisible gravity of competence and awareness. The boardroom transformed into a space where the presence of truth, articulated calmly and confidently, commanded the room more effectively than the trappings of authority could ever hope to achieve. Lila Thompson felt the subtle shift in attention across the room as John Harrington's initial shock gave way to measured consideration, his eyes scanning the contract with renewed focus, each line confirming the correctness of her insight. The sunlight streaming through the windows created shifting patterns on the polished mahogany table, glinting off pens, folders, and the small decorative items scattered around the boardroom, casting reflections that danced across the faces of the executives who were now leaning forward, their hands resting lightly on the table as they absorbed the implications of her words. Lila's posture remained composed, her hands resting gently on the edge of the contract, her gaze unwavering as she measured the weight of each glance cast her way, noting the subtle acknowledgment of competence and the dawning realization that her observation had altered the perception of authority in the room. The soft hum of the air conditioning combined with the faint background noise of the city beyond the windows, creating a gentle rhythm that underscored the tension, while the golden afternoon light accentuated the calm determination etched on her face. John Harrington's fingers hovered over the pen, then moved to grip the edge of the document more firmly, a slight crease forming in his brow as he processed the gravity of the potential outcome and the precision with which Lila had articulated the risk. Around the table, colleagues shifted slightly, the quiet rustle of paper and subtle adjustment of posture signaling their growing attentiveness and recognition of the truth she had spoken. Every microexpression, from the narrowing of an eyebrow to the subtle tilt of a head, was observed by Lila with keen awareness, each movement reinforcing the unspoken dialogue of understanding that flowed between her and the others in the room. The contrast between her modest attire and the luxurious surroundings, the polished wood, the reflective glass, and the soft gleam of metallic accents, highlighted the disparity in status, yet underscored the undeniable weight of knowledge wielded with clarity and confidence. Lila's steady breathing and deliberate movements anchored the room, creating a rhythm that drew attention to the importance of her insight, and the executives, previously reliant on assumptions of hierarchy, now responded to the authority carried in her calm, precise articulation. The sunlight continued its slow journey across the boardroom floor, illuminating the reflective surfaces in a manner that emphasized each detail, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow mirrored the unfolding realization that power could be informed by understanding rather than position alone. Lila's eyes briefly met John's, and in that quiet exchange, the room seemed to collectively acknowledge the shift in balance, the quiet assertion of competence and clarity overtaking assumptions of status, and the atmosphere hung poised, suspended between the weight of revelation and the unspoken recognition that the smallest voice, when informed and confident, could command attention in a way that demanded careful consideration from even the most powerful. Lila Thompson felt a subtle shift in the room as John Harrington's eyes lingered on the highlighted section of the contract, the usual firmness in his expression softening into contemplative stillness. The sunlight continued to filter through the tall windows, catching the edges of the polished mahogany table and scattering across the reflective surfaces of pens, folders, and glass awards, creating a network of light that seemed to emphasize the unfolding clarity. Each executive leaned slightly forward, hands resting lightly on the table, their attention fixed on the quiet authority she exuded, their previous skepticism tempered by the undeniable precision of her observation. Lila's posture remained composed, her fingers resting gently on the edge of the contract, her brown eyes steady and alert, scanning the subtle micro-expressions of everyone present. John Harrington exhaled slowly, his shoulders releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, and for the first time in the meeting, he allowed himself to consider the full weight of her insight, tracing each phrase and clause with careful attention. The faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city outside receded into the background, leaving the room suspended in the quiet rhythm of concentrated observation. Lila's presence anchored the room, her calm and deliberate movements communicating confidence and authority without a single raised voice, the light glancing across her face and uniform reinforcing her poised composure. The assistants nearby shifted subtly, exchanging brief glances, recognizing the significance of what had been revealed, the silent acknowledgment in their eyes amplifying the tension in the space. Every detail, the smooth polish of the table, the subtle reflection of sunlight on metal and glass, the precise articulation of her words, underscored the gravity of the moment, highlighting the contrast between conventional power and the quiet influence of prepared knowledge. John Harrington's gaze flicked from the contract to Lila, a new awareness dawning, the rigid lines of control in his posture giving way to the first traces of respect and acknowledgement that the situation required careful consideration. Lila maintained her stance, breathing steadily, each subtle motion reinforcing the weight of her insight and the clarity of her position. The light shifted slowly across the room, illuminating the interplay of shadow and reflection, emphasizing each measured breath, each deliberate glance, each micro-expression that communicated authority and composure. The executives, attuned to the change, absorbed the impact silently, the room collectively recognizing that the precision of understanding, articulated with quiet confidence, could command attention and shift perception in a way that no assertion of status or wealth alone could achieve. The atmosphere became charged with awareness, every small movement, tilt of the head, subtle repositioning of hands, a deliberate inhale, carrying amplified significance as Lila's steady presence reshaped the dynamic, turning what had begun as a routine meeting into a tableau of recognition, insight, and emergent respect, where clarity of thought and accuracy had become the most powerful force in the room. John Harrington sat back in his chair, a slow exhale escaping his lips as he allowed himself a moment of reflection, the rigid composure he had maintained all morning now giving way to an internal reckoning. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows traced diagonal patterns across the polished boardroom table, illuminating the fine wood grain and catching the subtle sheen of his gold cufflinks, the contrast of light and shadow mirroring the shift in his thoughts. His eyes followed the lines of the contract once more, each word resonating with the realization that he had underestimated both the complexity of the clause and the acumen of the person standing before him. Lila Thompson remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the table, her steady brown eyes observing the faint flicker of doubt and consideration crossing his face, a silent acknowledgment that the truth she had presented was undeniable. Around the room, the executives had grown still, their earlier whispers and tentative gestures replaced by focused attention, the quiet tension stretching the space as everyone absorbed the impact of her insight. The subtle hum of the air conditioning mingled with the faint, distant sounds of the city, emphasizing the calm gravity of the moment, while the sunlight shifted slowly, highlighting the contours of John's thoughtful expression and the composed steadiness of Lila's stance. He ran a hand through his hair, a minor but revealing gesture of introspection, and leaned slightly forward, his gaze softening as he considered not only the contractual implications, but also the broader lesson in humility and attention to detail that had been delivered so calmly. Lila's posture did not falter, her presence steady, her breathing measured, each subtle movement reinforcing the quiet assertion of authority that did not require a title or an ostentatious display of power. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the reflective surfaces of the table, pens, and awards catching the shifting light and amplifying the gravity of the realization unfolding. John's thoughts ran through scenarios, potential outcomes, and alternative approaches, each one filtered through the newfound recognition that insight and precision, rather than rank or status, had determined the correct understanding. The assistants and colleagues shifted slightly, their eyes fixed on the subtle interplay of recognition and acknowledgment, their postures echoing the respect that had silently grown in the room. The afternoon light accentuated the sharpness of the table's edges and the gleam of the pen tips, each reflection emphasizing the contrast between external appearances of authority and the internal weight of informed judgment. Lila's calm and deliberate presence anchored the space, her small frame conveying a disproportionate influence through careful preparation and measured articulation. John's gaze lifted to meet hers fully for the first time, the quiet acknowledgment in his eyes speaking volumes, an unspoken understanding that the clarity and courage she displayed had shifted the dynamics of the room irrevocably. Time stretched in that suspended moment, each second weighted with the recognition that knowledge, patience, and quiet confidence had proven more compelling than the assumptions of power he had carried in. The room remained hushed, each person attuned to the subtle reverberations of understanding, the balance between humility and authority now subtly redrawn, and John's mind lingered on the realization that he had learned something far more profound than the details of a contract. That true influence is measured by insight and integrity, not by status or title. Lila Thompson observed quietly as John Harrington reached for his laptop, opening a series of emails from the legal department and external counsel that confirmed the accuracy of her interpretation. The sunlight falling across the polished conference table caught the metallic edges of the laptop and the pens beside it, scattering reflections like fragments of understanding as the executives leaned in, drawn by the revelation unfolding in real time. Each email, precise and detailed, corroborated the consequences she had identified, highlighting the potential financial and legal exposure that could have been overlooked. The room remained silent except for the soft click of keys and the subtle shifting of papers, the weight of her discovery anchoring every gaze upon her. John's fingers hovered above the keyboard, paused mid-motion as he absorbed the implications, his expression a mix of realization and quiet respect, the careful line of his jaw softening as comprehension settled in. Lila's posture stayed firm, hands resting lightly on the edge of the contract, eyes meeting his briefly, a subtle acknowledgment passing without a word, conveying both confidence and calm authority. The assistants adjusted their positions, some leaning closer to the documents, others simply taking in the unfolding scene, their previous uncertainty replaced by a recognition that the smallest and most unassuming presence had revealed critical information that demanded immediate attention. The afternoon light continued its slow movement across the room, casting long shadows that stretched over the table and chairs, accentuating the contrast between the opulence of the office and the understated power of knowledge that Lila carried effortlessly. Each executive's expression shifted subtly, their eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and contemplation, the realization that careful observation and preparation could outweigh traditional measures of status. John Harrington's gaze lingered on Lila, a silent acknowledgment of the expertise and composure she had displayed, his posture relaxing just enough to signal the acceptance of her authority in this specific matter. The reflective surfaces of the room, the polished table, the glass awards, the metal accents of the pens, caught the light intermittently, mirroring the clarity that had emerged from her precise explanation and the supporting documentation now visible on the screen. The quiet hum of the air conditioning, combined with the muted city sounds outside, provided a steady backdrop that allowed the subtle tension and resolution within the room to remain the focal point. Lila's calm breathing and deliberate stance anchored the environment, her steady presence reinforcing the understanding that insight and meticulous preparation could command attention far beyond what titles or appearance might suggest. Every motion in the room, from John's careful scrolling through emails to the executive's attentive posture, highlighted the moment of recognition, the subtle validation that knowledge applied with precision had shifted the balance of consideration in a way that could not be ignored. The sunlight continued to filter through the tall windows, illuminating the room in a warm glow, emphasizing the shift in authority from assumption to demonstrated understanding, and the boardroom, once poised on tension and expectation, now settled into a quiet acknowledgment that Lila Thompson's insight had irrevocably shaped the course of the meeting, her clear articulation and precise knowledge creating a lasting impression of competence and calm mastery. Lila Thompson finally allowed herself a faint, composed smile, the kind that did not seek applause but carried the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a room filled with expectation, authority, and the weight of potential error. The sunlight had shifted lower, casting long, warm beams across the polished mahogany table, glinting off pens, folders, and the edges of the laptop where John Harrington's fingers rested, reflecting a subtle interplay of light and shadow that mirrored the balance between humility and acknowledgment in the room. John leaned back slightly, a contemplative calm settling over his posture, the lines of tension easing as he absorbed the full impact of what had transpired, his eyes meeting Lila's with a recognition that extended beyond the immediate contractual implications to an understanding of clarity, preparation, and presence as forms of influence. The assistants and executives around the table were motionless, the previous air of skepticism now replaced by quiet appreciation, small nods of acknowledgement passing almost imperceptibly from one person to another as they processed the transformation of the meeting from routine procedural discussion into a testament of competence and insight. The distant hum of the city outside was softened by the heavy curtains and thick glass of the office windows, leaving the room to the nuanced sounds of subtle paper shuffles, the faint click of a laptop closing, and the soft intake of breath from those present, all amplified by the charged silence that now defined the space. Lila's posture remained upright, hands lightly resting on the edge of the contract, her brown eyes scanning the room in measured observation, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor, the change in focus, the softening of expressions, all evidence of the recognition her insight had engendered. Light caught the metallic edges of the pens and the reflective surfaces of awards, sending fragments of brightness across the room, each glint a visual echo of the understanding that had taken root in the minds of those present. John Harrington exhaled fully, a slow, controlled release, and leaned forward, fingers tracing the lines of the document one final time, the quiet acknowledgement in his eyes revealing the depth of comprehension and the respect that had been earned without a single overt display of authority or domination. The room held still, the faint rhythm of movement and the slow descent of sunlight creating a tableau of calm resolution, every detail, the polished wood, the smooth glass, the sheen on the pens, accentuating the finality of recognition and the subtle power of quiet competence. Lila's presence anchored the atmosphere, her measured breathing and deliberate stance a subtle assertion that influence and command could be expressed without volume, without grandeur, and without pretense. The executives, now attentive and contemplative, adjusted their posture subtly, acknowledging the shift that had occurred, and the room became a space of quiet respect, an environment where preparation, insight, and clarity had redefined the dynamics of authority. Sunlight continued to illuminate the details of the room, tracing long lines across the polished surfaces, reflecting the serene but undeniable shift in perception. In that suspended moment, Lila Thompson stood as a figure of composed mastery, her knowledge and presence having reshaped not only the immediate understanding of the contract, but also the unspoken acknowledgment of what competence, confidence, and careful observation could achieve in a world defined by assumption, status, and expectation, leaving a lingering impression that would endure long after the meeting concluded.